look, what I want to do today, it's called the Introduction to the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto, as I'm sure people are aware, was written by Marx and Engels. There's a lot of debate about this because Marx wrote the kind of final draft of it, which is the one that we use. But before that, Engels wrote a little book called Principles of Communism, which sort of was a question and answer about what communists stood for, what socialists stood for. And then that was the kind of first draft, if you like, and then Marx went and wrote the final version. But it's in both their names, and they both, obviously, all their lives stuck by what was written in it, even though they lived for another, Marx died in 1883, this was published in 1848. Engels lived quite a bit longer, till 1895. But this was the foundation and the very simple explanation of their principles. And it was written, it was kind of commissioned by a socialist organisation known as the Communist League, which was essentially a group of German exiles. Marx and Engels themselves, of course, were German exiles. Germany was not a united country, but was a very repressive country under the main German state, which of course was Prussia. It was a country where if you wanted to be a socialist or to challenge the ruling class, you had to do it from Paris or Brussels or London. You couldn't do it from your own country. And of course, throughout the 1840s, we had a situation where Europe was in growing ferment. People perhaps most famously know about the Irish famine, but there was famine in Belgium. There were food shortages everywhere. There were all sorts of uprisings. When Engels first came to England, he came in the aftermath of the great Chartist strike, general strike, which took place in 1842. So you had all those, you had a great deal of ferment, great deal of political unrest, and people were very, very discontented with, particularly in countries like Germany and Austria and Italy. They were very, very discontented with the old order, and they wanted a new order. And there were all sorts of socialists, I'll talk about them a little bit into the talk, but there were all sorts of socialists who were trying to organise, but did so on a very small scale, and did so, I'm hoping you can still hear me, but we'll just do our best. Did so on a very small scale. They were, as I said, they were émigrés, and if anybody knows anything about émigré politics, you will know that it is often very faction-riven, if you want to call it that, that people who are forced into exile, actually it's quite difficult for them to build among the working class or among the wider movement in the country that they go to, and therefore a lot of what it was like was a lot of debates between small groups of socialists. You might think this is a bit familiar in Britain today in 2022, but that's something we can perhaps talk about. So anyway, the Communist League commissioned this Communist Manifesto. Marx, of course, was late with it. Engels was actually a much more, reliable writer in all sorts of ways, so he got a sharp rebuke from them, and eventually it did deliver at the end of 1847, beginning of 1848, and was published in February 1848, by which, coincidentally, was the beginning of a whole wave of revolutions that swept across Europe, from Sicily in the south right through to Belgium and to France in the north. So very, very timely, although I think you have to assume that the Communist Manifesto didn't actually directly influence the events of the 1848 revolutions. Although it has to be said, Marx and Engels very much did try to. They both went back to Germany, where Marx edited a left-wing newspaper. Engels was involved in fighting right up to 1849 in the southern parts of Germany. They were very, very committed revolutionaries. What were they talking about? What were the basic ideas inside the Communist Manifesto? The first is the most important one that I think that comes across in the Communist Manifesto is this idea that all history, all hitherto existing history, is the history of class struggle. Now, sometimes when we think about this, when we think about class struggle today we think about the strikes that are going on, we think about all these kind of things. Of course, when they were writing, you weren't talking about class struggle perhaps in that kind of way, because it was only in England and a bit in Scotland that you had a really developed working class. You know, the Industrial Revolution had come first to Britain, and you had this major organised working class, which was very, very important. That didn't exist, except as a small feature of society in many other countries. So this was, when they talked about class struggle in their time, they were talking about the struggle between the old absolutist order, the old feudalism, the old religion, which was the Catholic Church, the old institutions, the princes and emperors and electors and all the other people who ruled these little patchwork of states in Germany. They represented the old order, and what they called the bourgeois revolutions, the revolutions which would usher in capitalist development, were ones that took place involving, there's big arguments about how much the bourgeoisie itself was directly involved in these revolutions, but involving the new industrialists, the new capitalist class, the new people who developed in these ways, plus the kind of the lawyers and the students and the artisans and the working class where it existed. These were the people on the side of revolution and change in 1848, and the old absolutists, the clerical, the religious, the people who supported the monarchs who still existed in most parts of Europe were on the other side. So that was the first point that they make. And they make this point because they say, if you look at history, you can't understand it by a series of, you know, as Toynbee said, one damn thing after another. You can't understand it by a series of sort of disconnected facts. You can't understand it by the sort of great men and great women in history type of view. You have to understand it as the tension between different classes in society, and that the way, for Marx, the origins of how he saw his ideas of historical materialism was that men and women labour in order to be able to create their subsistence. In other words, be able to feed and clothe and house themselves. And they use tools in order to do this, and society develops as they develop in these kind of ways, but that the old ways of doing things begin to change as the forces of production change, and in that situation you get a clash between the ideas of society and the institutions of society and the structure of society. You get a clash between those and the forces of production themselves. In other words, society's economic forces are moving forward, and this brings them into conflict with the old ideas, the old religions, all of these kind of things. And Marx and Engels spend some time talking about how are great admirers of capitalism in one way. You know, we always think of ourselves as anti-capitalist, quite rightly, and they were very much against the capitalist class, but they also saw capitalism as a progressive force compared to what had gone before it. And therefore, if you read the Communist Manifesto, it talks quite a lot about the way in which capitalism revolutionises everything and sweeps away some of the old ideas, sweeps away the old ideas about women, or sweeps away the old ideas about the way in which society should be organised. It creates a whole new religion. The Protestant religion is essentially very much connected with the rise of merchant capital and then of industrial capital itself. So all of these they see doing in this kind of way, and they say it's a very famous phrase from the Communist Manifesto, is that all that is solid melts into air, that as soon as the capitalist mode of production develops and spreads, and it does spread worldwide, as soon as that happens, then you've got, it clashes so greatly with the different old societies, different ways of producing goods, different industries. If you look at, for example, one of the things that the English cotton industry did was to destroy the Indian cotton industry because it couldn't compete with machinery. That was essentially, it was inferior, it was superior in all sorts of ways, but it couldn't compete with the levels of production of the English Industrial Revolution. So they talk about this, but then at the same time, they talk about the way that it creates these new modes of production also begin to create their own fetters, because they develop all sorts of ideas, all sorts of institutions, which actually prevent the development of society. And they talk about this very much in the Communist Manifesto, in terms of capitalism is this fantastic revolutionising force, but what's the result of it? The result of it isn't, wealth and prosperity for everybody. Actually, the result of it is a fantastically divided class society, and a society where, far from it being that there's enough for everybody in a kind of rational kind of way, one of the things they talk about is the problem of overproduction. And they use this, let me just quote from it, because they talk about the way in which too many goods are produced. In the crisis, when you get a capitalist crisis, it says a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. And that's still true. You get this through slumps, you get it through wars, you get it through all sorts of things, where huge amounts of wealth and production are just destroyed in that way. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity. The epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed, and why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. So he talks about this as this crisis of overproduction is a result of capitalist accumulation, and of course capitalist accumulation, the drive to accumulate, isn't a rational drive to accumulate, it's a drive of competition between different capitalists. And in this situation, the main thing, and Marx refers to this elsewhere as accumulate, this is Moses and all the prophets, this is all the things that capital cares about, is just producing more and more goods. So, Sainsbury's competes with Waitrose, BMW competes with Mercedes, you get all these different companies, huge companies that compete with one another, and the result is they produce more and more goods, but then you get this crisis of overproduction. So they talk about this as at the heart of the failings of the capitalist system. They also talk about the abolition, and they say you could sum up the aim of the communists in one sentence: the abolition of private property. This, which is a huge, if anybody's ever been in debates about what socialists would do, will they take away my whatever it is, will I still be able to, wear my own clothes? Will I have to dress in uniform? Will I be able to buy anything? These are serious questions that people ask, because the whole notion of collective organisation and the abolition of private property suggests that that's going to happen. But no, they're not going to take away your favourite chair. They're not going to take away your bike. They're not going to take away any of these things. What it's about, and Marx puts this very well, he says it's a social power property. It's a social power. A minority of people in this world have access to that social power. They own property, and actually for most of us, most of our lives, we don't own much property, or not much that's worth very much, even on eBay, is the honest truth of the matter. So it's a social power, it's control of the means of production. That's what you're talking about when you're talking about private property, and that's what Marx wants to abolish. Now, of course, in this situation, which by this stage is looking sort of fairly grim for most of us, there's these crises, there's the private property which is in the hands of a tiny number of people, and so on. But of course, Marx is one of his great contributions to previous socialist thought is, of course, the idea that the working class isn't just the victim of capitalism, but is actually also the gravedigger of capitalism, as he refers to it. And it's precisely the nature of the exploitation of the worker, the fact that they do have to produce the wealth in society, but most of that wealth is taken away from them. It's precisely this that gives them the power to organise collectively and to overthrow the system. And in fact, the way in which you could describe this is that capitalism is actually abolished by the class struggle it engenders, that it creates this working class, it creates this very powerful working class. And not only that, capitalism has to abolish the whole, the working class has to abolish the whole capitalist system in order to make a revolution. But of course, then it also has to abolish the conditions of its own existence, that it has to overcome its exploitation, it has to overcome its alienation from the products of its labour to create a fully socialist or communist society. So those are some of the basic ideas that are in the Communist Manifesto. I very much recommend people reading it because it is an incredibly condensed version of the basic ideas of Marx and Engels. It's not just about this. It's worth just saying a couple of other things about what it covers in the Communist Manifesto. It's not just an explanation of their basic theory. It answers loads of questions. You know, is it true that capitalism would abolish the family? Isn't that already abolished by the whole notion of marriage and so on? Isn't it that women are actually already enthralled to men and to the family and so on? So it answers all these sorts of questions. It also defines what the communists are in relation to other socialist or left organisations, and it's worth perhaps just looking at this a little bit, not because, you know, when we're talking again in 2022, if you're talking about the people that they talked about, obviously they're people of a particular time and they came from a particular set of circumstances. But I think you can see some of the same ideas in the whole idea of organisation today. And they talk that because capitalism developed unevenly, and because you had different organisations in different countries, and because you had all sorts of repressive structures that people had to fight against, you had all sorts of different approaches to how you could overthrow capitalism. I mean, there was a kind of conspiracist, you know, the idea of a small number of people who would sort of band together and overthrow it was a very, very common view, and one that, I mean, it still is a common view in some ways, but one that Marx and Engels had to polemise against. They said it has to be the act of the working class itself, not a small group of, you know, well-educated individuals who can decide how best you can create a new society. Also, because Germany in particular was still not based on mass industrial production, as became the case later in the 19th century, but not at the time that this was written at all. Their socialism was very much dominated by what they called petty bourgeois socialism, small producers, small artisans, who had a very individualist and kind of reformist way of looking at how you could improve the system rather than fundamentally overthrow it. So they polemised that against that as well, and the people who followed that kind of view. So they you can read the originals. You can read. Marx wrote a book called The Poverty of Philosophy, aimed at a critique of Proudhon, and they also talked about the utopian socialists. I know people are familiar with the utopian socialists. Marx and Engels were great admirers of the utopian socialists in many ways. Engels knew Robert Owen, who was the man who people know about New Lanark, set up the model kind of factory and town in Scotland, and who was and set up a big general trade union very early on in the working class movement. And they were very complimentary about Owen, as they were about the French utopian socialists, who were Fourier and Saint-Simon were the main ones. But they said the problem with utopian socialism is that it sees what's wrong with capitalism, but because it developed very early on in the capitalist system, because it was a sort of one of the earliest ways of developing, it doesn't actually, it puts forward all sorts of grand schemes like New Lanark, or like the all sorts of new settlements that people would have and things like that. It puts forward all these grand schemes, but it doesn't see the working class as the centre of socialist revolution. It doesn't see it. It sees it as just one other set of victims rather than seeing it as being able to overcome capitalist society itself. And I think one of the great, when we're talking about the development of socialism, one of the great contributions, obviously, of Marx and Engels is to develop that idea that the working class is the agent of change rather than just the passive recipient of whatever bad or good happens to them. Okay, so I've nearly come to my conclusion. I just want to say one more thing, which is that there's a quote from Marx and Engels. They have a little bit on proletarians and communists. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mould the proletarian movement. Now, that I think needs a little bit of kind of unpacking a little bit, because really what it seems to be saying is you don't need revolutionary organisation, you just need to be part of the wider movement. And I think partly it's a misunderstanding. The word party in the 19th century very much meant movement as opposed to organised party, when you're talking about the early part of the 19th century, certainly. So when you say set up a new party, it doesn't mean exactly what we would think of as a party. It means you shouldn't split movements, you shouldn't split what the working class as a whole is doing. You shouldn't be setting yourself up as a separate model from that. So, and I think that's clear, and I think for all of us as socialists, whether we're in organisations or not, and obviously we're in Counterpart, and we want to build a revolutionary organisation, a mass revolutionary organisation, nonetheless, your starting point has to be that most people, even if you're a big organisation, don't necessarily agree with you. So how is it that you can work with people through movements, through trade unions, through wider movements that we've seen and that we continue to see going on, in order to advance the interests of the working class as a whole? And sectarianism is, and again, we're not free from this even all these years later, is a problem on the left, and it's something that has to be rejected. I think that that you don't support people because they don't like what they say about X, but therefore you don't support them over Y. Strikes me as just stupid, really. But anyway, that's the kind of things that I think we do take from it. It's worth knowing, however, that Marx and Engels actually pretty much all their lives, and they lived in very difficult circumstances, particularly after the defeat of the 1848 revolutions, and the sectarian squabbling and difficulty in London was at its peak among the German emigres, who'd been defeated and suffered very, very much, and so on. But pretty much most of their lives, they saw it as important to be in an organisation and to build an organisation. Now, they were in the Communist League, which, as I said, was a small organisation of German emigres. They weren't really in very much at all in the 1850s, because it was just kind of grim. And Marx went and started writing Capital and spent a lot of time in the British Library. And Engels had to go off to Manchester to work in his family cotton firm, and he used his salary to keep the Marx family a lot of the time while Marx was writing Capital. So they weren't so directly involved, although they were always involved in things that went on. And if you read their letters to each other and to other people, they're constantly talking about things that are happening and campaigns that they support and all this. And in the 1860s, they made the decision to set up what was called the International Working Men's Association, better known as the First International, where they brought together different groups of people from across Europe. And so they were involved in organisation then. That kind of went badly wrong after the defeat of the Paris Commune. So again, in defeat, you do get these splits and you do get these disagreements. But nonetheless, in the 1880s, which is when Marx died, so he was really not part of this, but Engels was part of the socialist organisations that grew up then, and so was actually all of Marx's daughters were active politically and Laura and Eleanor both played important roles in France and Britain, respectively, in the politics there, the left-wing politics there. But also when the ILP was formed in the 1890s, which was the forerunner of the Labour Party, Engels didn't play an active role in it, but he was incredibly enthusiastic about about it. And Eleanor Marx and her husband, Edward Aveling, also played a big role in it. So to me, just to say, I think that does need a little bit of explaining about why it is important that people who agree on a whole number of general principles and in particular strategy and tactics as to what we should be doing should be part of an organisation. So anyway, I'll leave it there.